Welcome everyone to Data Security Talk, the podcast that keeps you up to date with trends and approaches to business data security. My name is Guy Bavly. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Actifile. I'm here with my fellow and colleague co-founder, Assaf Litai. Today, Assaf and I are going to talk about data encryption, its origin, different types, and why it's important. So Assaf, when we look at the history of data encryption, we know that there were ancient ciphers like scissor cipher, and we know today there are many modern algorithms such AES, advanced encryption standards. What are the interesting stories that you see from history that highlight the importance of encryption to protect secrets?
So I think the most interesting and the most, obviously encryption started off as a way to protect data so that if I need to send a message to the king or to a military leader, I can get the message across to them without eavesdropping, without somebody realizing what is the message that I'm trying to convey. And trying to get that data across has been at the forefront of encryption from its beginning. But to that, when you start considering encryption such as asymmetric encryption, you started seeing how it laid the foundation for e-commerce and so forth. And at the end of the day, the use case of protecting data, the use cases of non-repudiation, so being able to prove who it is that sent the message, and anti-tampering have all gone into this grab bag of technologies that can help the modern security specialist.
Well, thinking about history, I remember that in the old, kingdoms, there used to be a very simple but efficient method. Messengers were shaving their heads completely, and something secret, so to speak, was engraved on their skull. And then there was no rush back then. There was no urgency usually. Things took time. So they grew their hair again, and they were a living, carrier of a secret, that wasn't really encrypted the way we're thinking about it today, but something that was hidden from people who did not know that the secret was there, and it evolves, through the time, through different, code methods and keeping secrets in different ways. So what are the basic, systems or methods that are types of encryption? People talk about symmetric encryption, asymmetric encryption, hashing. Can you give us a little bit background on that and highlight some real world use cases for each type?
So first of all, I'd like to that the example that you gave of writing on the scalp and then having the hair grow, that I would think is more under the line of like data obfuscation or hiding the data, right? It's less of an encryption. Encryption would be, for example, when you did the loop around the cane, and if you had the similar sized cane, there would be a message, or even better than that are character substitutions, where you replace the letter A with the letter D and the letter B with the letter F and so forth. And if you don't know what the substitution is, it's hard to figure out. Obviously, if you're a mathematician, all you do is analyze the frequencies of the different letters, and it's pretty clear what is an E, A, B, X. For example, Q is not going to appear a lot, X is not going to appear a lot. So if you see suddenly E appearing 5 times in a big piece of, then you assume that it's probably an X or something like that. So there's a lot of, obfuscation is definitely one thing. And a lot of times we obfuscate, for example, a key. So we use encryption, but we have to put the key with the encrypted message. So we obfuscate where it is that we put the key. Obviously, a smart hacker will be able to attack that. When we talk about symmetric and asymmetric encryption technologies, what we're really talking about is how the keys are exchanged and how the keys are addressed. So in symmetric, it's very easy. I have some sort of passphrase or a keyword or something like that, and both sides of the conversation have the same key, and I encrypt it on one hand, on one side, and then I decrypt it on the other, and everything is great. The problem is, what happens if I want to buy something at Amazon, right? And Jeff Bezos is not going to go around and giving the symmetric key to everyone. So how do I communicate in such a way that that I can protect that dialogue so that nobody can eavesdrop on that dialogue, and I can make sure that Jeff Bezos is on one side and it's not somebody who Jeff Bezos or something like that. And how can I make sure that on the other side it's the customer that says that he's the customer, and so forth. And PKI was a very interesting mathematical sort of solution to this problem, which basically has what's called an asymmetric key. So there is one key that's a private key that only Amazon has, and then the other half of the key, the public key, is just sent to everyone. So when you first connect, the public key gets transmitted to your browser. At that point, I can encrypt everything. Anything that I encrypt on my machine, only Amazon can open, and they're the only ones that can encrypt the message using their private key, and which I can open using the public key. So with that sort of transmission, I can make sure that the information is sent between me and Amazon. Nobody can eavesdrop along the way. And more importantly, no one can modify. So somebody will say, oh, I want you to, you want to buy a package of toilet papers, but somebody along the way wants to intercept that and say, well, actually, I want a 50-inch TV. And oh, don't send it to that person, but send it to my house in the Everglades. So, the idea is, so nobody can go into that transaction, nobody can eavesdrop on that transaction, and nobody can modify or corrupt that transaction. So that's where PKI, or public key infrastructure, comes into play.
And when people are saying 128-bit, 256-bit, it's how strong the encryption is according to the different methods, right?
Keys, how strong the keys are, and how strong the passphrases are, and so forth. Yes.
Exactly. So if you want to understand completely the method, then it's asymmetric plus how strong it is the key in terms of how many bits the key is contains. So if we move forward and today's role of encryption in data security, how do you see that as a core pillar next to other methods like access control and monitoring? How do you leverage encryption to eventually reach the level of integrity and authenticity of data next to access control and monitoring?
So encryption falls into all three. So the CIA model, the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of data. So obviously, all three of these have a part in the cryptographic world. I think that in the context of data security, right? So you're trying to protect the data, but it's always the question of what are your different layers. So there's everything from access controls. There are ADRs, which are typically it's not a cryptographic tool, but it helps identify when something malicious is trying to break into your network and steal your data. There are things such as whole disk encryption, file level encryption, and so forth, which go in, which play the part that if somebody steals the data, but the data is encrypted, then they can't utilize the data. They have nothing they can sell on the market. They have nothing that's of use to them. So there are a lot of different uses for encryption in this case. There is encrypting the transmission of the data, for example, over SSL, TLS, and so forth. There is the encryption of the the interaction of the identity management system, and so forth. Things such as generation of the multi-factor authentication, all the way to protecting the data as it's stored or as it's transmitted.
So, Asaf, when we're talking about the role of encryption in data security, people often talk about the CIA model. Can you explain to us how encryption ensures the CIA model, please?
So, in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, obviously, the confidentiality is easy, right? If I can protect my transmission of information, for example, over SSL or in an encrypted email, if I can secure the storage, for example, full disk encryption or file level encryption, I'm basically protecting the storage of the data. If I can use an encrypted mailbox, if I can use things of the encrypted database. So in that case, if somebody steals the database, they don't have access to the data. So confidentiality is easy. Integrity is really about calculating things such as hashes and so forth, and making sure that the data is um, not compromised and not and so forth. So the last part is availability, and I would say that encryption is useful in some cases for securing for example, things such as backups and disaster recovery plans and so forth. But availability more than often is a question of backup systems, disaster recovery, and so forth, and less of encryption mechanisms.
When discussing the CII model, I think we have a straightforward approach with encryption in terms of confidentiality, and also with integrity, not give options to other malicious attackers to change the integrity of the data, and the availability is primarily of mechanisms like backup and restore. So when you think about encryption, there are different methods of managing encryption. People talk about user-managed encryption versus centrally managed encryption. Can you help us define those two approaches and give us some insights about the pros and the cons for organizations using those two types, and what do you think is right for MSPs?
So first of all, I don't think there's one size fits all in any sort of solution. Obviously, the more granular the encryption, the more granular the key usage is, and so forth, the more, I would call it, the more secure or the more resilient your security model is, because even if one key is compromised, the rest of the keys are not compromised. And there are a lot of advantages to doing that. There's also a lot of disadvantages. It's it's very difficult to manage. What happens if you transfer a file from one person to another? How do you do the key exchange? Does one have to decrypt and the other has to encrypt? There are a lot of mechanisms like that which attempt to solve this sort of issues, but it's never easy. It's always a complicated sort of situation. It's good in particular cases where security is paramount and you're willing to put up with the additional headache of managing such a system. Where you have uh, let's call it more of an organizational key scheme and so forth, then obviously your data is protected inside the organization. But if your key is somehow compromised, or if there is a problem with the key, then at that point your data is exposed. So you have to be very careful, right? It's you put all the eggs in one basket, if you will. So I think it's a question of, what is appropriate for different use cases. If you have, a very important secret, then use some sort of like enterprise grade or some sort of encryption subsystem which salts the key very well and does very good sort of encryption, proven encryption, and protected using a key, and then somehow manage that key in some vault somewhere, and then that data, that ultra secret, is protected. But if your issue is how do I reduce the attack surface of my data, if my problem is how do I prevent ransomware from stealing data and so forth, then that becomes very costly to do if you do it for every file that might have an SSN or every file that might have CY or something like that. So you need a more automated sort of solution that will help you
Yeah, yeah,
get that in an easy to use
yeah,
manner,
yeah.
easy
So
to
to
deploy manner.
summarize, yeah. So to summarize, the user-driven encryption or the user-driven management of encryption is suitable for highly classified secrets where you want to be very specific with the key and assign a key to that secret specifically, where you are willing to pay the extra, a maintenance cost of potentially managing, different keys for different secrets, and the inability of different users that have different secrets and keys to exchange those secrets between them. You have to manage that, but it's definitely suitable for that use case. If all you need
Yeah,
to do,
one
okay,
thing you have to remember is that if you encrypt something using a key you don't remember, you just lost the availability of that data. So your
yeah,
confidentiality side just ruined your availability side. So it's
exactly,
very important when you do something like that to make sure that you do back up the keys and make sure that you do it on a routine basis and so forth. And it's a tough thing to do. Also, another problem with user side encryption is users might forget to encrypt data. So if you have a lot of data that they're not aware of, right? Maybe it's a project that they worked on 2 years ago but forgot about it, or maybe they're just not careful, right? You have some of the employees who will religiously encrypt some stuff, and then others who forget, right, and don't want to go through the process, right? They feel it's an overhead for them, and so forth. So that's another issue with user side encryption.
yeah. And if you're going for centrally managed encryption, it's definitely a better suitable, a method of doing, creating some kind of a virtual boundary between the organization. Everyone is sharing the same key. The files are encrypted within that virtual organization. Everybody can open it using the same key. And if the file is stolen or misplaced outside the organization, then nobody can open it without that key, of course. But it's not fine granular. It's not, very specific to a secret, but it's much easier to manage, and it's suitable for that specific use case that we're talking about. So if we're talking about, different methods, and we're in some way talked about also about the cost of operation or the overhead of, managing different types of encryption. How do you see, and of course you're talking with a lot of customers and MSPs on a regular basis. What do you see the challenges, the common challenges that might arise from activating encryption? Key management issues, it could be performance issues. What do you see those challenges are, and do you have any practical tips to overcome those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that MSPs typically see their role, the most important role is uptime, right? So making sure that the customer is up and running and making sure that they have availability of the data and integrity of the data and so forth. Confidentiality as well. So they typically would install EDRs. They typically would install, things like Entra, Active Directory, or other identity management and so forth. And they will try to protect the data as much as they can. But one thing they have to be, if they're going down the route of encryption, is to make sure that they understand how that encryption works, and that they keep a backup of all the keys, and that they understand how to retrieve data in case of system downtime. So, for example, typically when you deploy something like BitLocker, which is full disk encryption from Microsoft, you want to keep a backup of the recovery key, so that if the user, something happens to his laptop or something, or that laptop is reset, then at some point it'll boot and require the recovery key. So making sure that you have the recovery keys for all of your machines is extremely important. To do it in a way which is right, you have 20 customers, 50 customers, 100 customers, to make sure you do that for every device on every customer across all of your customers, that becomes a management chore. Luckily, purveyors such as Microsoft automate this process and make it easy for you to manage, for example, the BitLocker recovery key. When you use systems, other systems, you want to make sure that they allow you to do these types of things. They allow you to recover data in case of a problem with the encryption, decryption, and so forth. You want to make sure that you have backups of the key, you understand how to recover data, and so forth, to make sure that that added layer of confidentiality doesn't affect availability. So you want to protect the data, but keep it available for the business.
And I hear MSP's concerns about performance related issues when operating with encryption, especially file level encryption. What's your take on that specific potential concern or challenge?
So if you think about encryption, and you think about, so encryption and decryption, the performance issues are asymmetrical, right? If I want to encrypt a lot of data, it's going to take some time. The more resource I take, the less time it's going to take. Obviously, if I throttle my encryption, then I'm going to be able to use the computer as I'm encrypting, but it's going to take more time to encrypt the data. In terms of where performance is impacted, is when you open an encrypted file or close a decrypted file, in which case the system needs to decrypt the file in real time. Back in 2000 to maybe 2005 and so forth, I don't know if anybody here remembers, but there used to be accelerator cards for SSLs and things of that sort, because the encryption would take resources. Today, with a modern, modern class CPUs, it's so fast. It's actually almost as fast as opening the file without the encryption. If you add things such as BitLocker or our product Actifile, the difference in the performance is supposed to be very, very low. Obviously, you have to make sure that you deploy it according to best practices and so forth. So,
Yeah, yeah,
each encryption system has its own requirements.
yeah, absolutely. So when discussing encryption, there's also the angle, the context of compliance. There are different, compliance requirements like GDPR, HIPAA, CCPA. Is there a possibility that MSPs can leverage encryption to help their customers meet those regulatory requirements and avoid penalties? Is encryption helpful in that case?
So today, things such as encrypting data are part of the requirements of most, if not all, of the different frameworks, different security frameworks. I think the most important thing for an MSP and their customers to do is understand what is the data that the customer has. Until you know what data the customer has, it's really, and how much of it they have, it's really difficult to answer the question of whether encryption is a necessity or a nice to have or even not needed, right? It depends on the amount of things such as private information, things such as protected health information, things such as CY and so forth. So when you have the issue with data is, a lot of times, so we think about data, there's two classes of data. There's data that is important to me. I have a secret. I want to prevent you from accessing that secret. And then I value whether I need to secure it using encryption or not, and what type of encryption is warranted. Obviously, if I'm the CIA and I have a list of spies, then I'm going to encrypt it really, really well. I'm going to put it on a hard disk that's not connected to the network, and I'm going to hide that hard disk 10 floors below the Pentagon, somewhere that's inaccessible to almost anyone except ultra privileged people. If I have other pieces of data, maybe I don't need to protect them. The other type of data is data that other people care about. So, for example, data that you're entrusted with. And for example, patients might give you their health records and they trust you to protect it. And the government is enacting that trust through HIPAA. The same is with financial institutions. Today, anybody who gives out financing, even like a car dealership, is required to follow the FTC safeguard rules. So that's because you have data that's private and related to your customers. You might have utility bills. You might have copy of their social security card. You might have other types of information that they gave you and they expect you to protect. The government might give you data. For example, CUI, controlled unclassified information, is data that the government gives you and expects you, it's not classified, but they expect you to protect it as if it's classified, right? So all of those cases are where the government and the people tell you, listen, I will not take it lightly if you abuse this data. And one way to protect this data is, for example, using encryption. So obviously you want to have a firewall. Obviously you want to have, things of that sort. But, one thing to consider is if all else fails, what is there to protect that data? And encryption, for example, is a good way to protect that data.
So,
Now,
so
what,
yeah,
one thing to add to that, and I think that this is important. Encryption also, in a lot of cases, provides safe haven to
yeah.
if the data is stolen. So that, for example, if the data is stolen and you can show that during the time it was stolen, it was encrypted using NIST standard encryption, like AES 256 and stuff like that, then in most cases, you are not required to disclose that breach or to provide any remedies to that breach. So it makes sense to say, listen, we have some of the security is reactive to somebody trying to break in. So we have EDRs, we have firewalls, we have all those things. But if somebody manages to get through, and we hear about people getting through all the time using all sorts of firewalls and EDRs and systems, to make sure that it's encrypted will only help the compliance stance.
Yeah, because then you will be in safe haven, you'll be in compliance, you'll adhere to all the privacy regulations out there. So it's not just a security framework desired, capability. It's also something that will put you in safe haven when we're talking about regulatory requirements. So Asaf, we're living now in a hybrid, computational world. There are endpoints and file servers on-prem, and there are cloud file repositories like Office 365 and Google Workspaces and S3. So what is the role, what's the importance of encryption in, securing data when you're talking about those, hybrid environments, and specifically when you're talking about cloud file repository, cloud environments? How do you see that?
So I think it's anytime you talk about encrypting a specific repository and so forth, I think the real question you have to ask yourself is what is, if you take, for example, the factor analysis of information risk model, FAIR model, you talk about two things. One is the likelihood of having a breach, and the second is the loss magnitude. So if you have data and there is a potential breach that's going to happen, then obviously at that point you want to think about security controls, whether they're reactive security controls or whether you want to encrypt or whether you want to do to even deleting data is a control, right? If you delete the data, they can't steal it. So that's an interesting control. Um, so when we think about cloud and we think about endpoints and we think about servers and we think about NAS, the question I always have is how much data is there? And a lot of people, oh, it's the cloud. There's probably a lot of data. And my answer to that is always people always think all kinds of things. Reality is always different. Whatever they think, reality is guaranteed to be different. How different reflects on how clueless they are, right? If they're different but only marginally, then they're very, very good. Very few of your customers are going to be like that. If they're completely off, which is, a lot of customers are like that, then at that point, once you go through a data risk audit, once you go and you discover the data, then you could say, listen, most of my data is in the cloud, or I thought most of my data is in the cloud, but a lot of it is actually in the file server or the old NAS that's sitting in the corner or on the boss's laptop. We've seen cases like that as well. And at that point, you can ask yourself, okay, should it be on the boss's laptop? If it shouldn't, maybe have a discussion with the boss. It's not a comfortable discussion to tell the boss that he has that much data, but you might want to do it because that's the responsibility of the MSP, is to warn the customer and say, this is what you have and this is what we recommend be done about it. And you can encrypt the data, you can move the data to safe storage somewhere, you can delete it, you can encrypt it,
So,
you can do
so,
whatever you want with the data.
so your take, Asaf, in that context of do I need to encrypt data in the cloud or not? You're saying, first of all, it's a question of how much data and what type of data do you have, aka how much data risk do you have. And if you have such, data risk, regardless of its location, endpoint, server, or cloud, the best practice to proactively and preemptively to encrypt it. So for you, cloud is yet another repository. It's another place where there's, passive waiting to the attack to happen, mechanisms, and of course somebody can bypass those mechanisms and breach also the cloud, and then your data can be stolen, and if stolen, then it's not protected anymore. So that's an
One
important.
thing, this is a great point. Yeah, you're making a great point, which is when you look at, right, so we said, for example, the fair model is a multiplication of the frequency of incidents times the loss magnitude. So obviously, if the loss magnitude stays constant, maybe grows over time as I collect more and more customer records or health information and so forth, but it more or less stays the same, the attack surface area keeps changing, right? So people find different ways to get into the cloud or into a server or into the NAS or into, so that keeps on changing. So that if you can, for example, use encryption to reduce the loss magnitude, then you're forever changing that risk model. You're reducing the impact of that risk model, whatever happens on the attack front. To keep up with the attack front means you have to always install new EDRs, check to see what are the zero-day exploits and things of that sort that are likely to happen, and they're very hard to protect against. Meanwhile, encryption is resilient typically to most of these attacks.
So a follow-up question to that stuff. So many times when the data is on-prem, endpoints or file servers, people presume that it's their accountability, the customer or the MSP's, accountability. Is it true to presume that if I put my data in Office 365 wherever, or Google Workspace or S3, that Microsoft, Google, or Amazon are going to be accountable if something happened and data is stolen from the cloud repository? Or do I need to as the customer or the MSP to be proactive and put layers of protection, such as encryption, on top of the data?
So I'd say, first of all, this is a legal question. Liability is a legal question. And therefore, I'd say consult with your lawyer more than anything that you hear on different podcasts, including this one. But I will say, but I will say that that question depends on a lot of things. For example, is it a paid subscription, or are you using a free OneDrive? What are or Google Drive? What are the terms stipulated in the EULA for that level of subscription? Do you have a business associate agreement? In which case, obviously, Microsoft and Google will take some of that liability off of your back. And also, do you use the best practices that they require you to use in order for the terms of the EULA to be,
So
in effect?
yeah, so you have this is not a question for our data security podcast, but definitely it's something that you should, as an MSP and a customer, look into, and not assume that someone else will
Never
take the
assume.
yeah,
Never
yeah,
assume.
yeah. Assumption is not in place
The
usually
mother of all
everywhere,
evil.
especially not here.
Of all
Yeah,
evil, right?
yeah. So maybe looking a little bit into the future, just as we wrap up this edition. People talk a lot about emerging, threats to encryption, such as quantum computing, and have a potential, option to break the current encryption standards. So, how do you see the world in a post-quantum cryptography world, and how can organizations can prepare for that upcoming era that is lurking around the corner, so to speak?
So I remember the first time I heard about post quantum computing, it wasn't called that. The quantum computer, somewhere in the 90s, I think it was one of the pages of Electron magazine and so forth. I remember that IBM computer thing and so forth. And they were beginning to talk about how this will change the future of cryptography. That was 25 years ago. And here we are, and we're talking about quantum computers being able, using the Shor algorithm, to basically solve the primary equations behind encryption, that make it, factorial analysis and things of that sort. And, but it isn't here yet. What we're saying, because we are, as a, for example, for the purpose of protecting data, you're thinking about what is a encryption algorithm that is acceptable, is the NIST, is a standard, so you could use it for both regulatory as well as security purposes. One of the things you can do, you typically do, is choose, for example, a NIST recommended standard like AES and AS 256 and so forth and up. NIST have in August released their new cryptography modules for post quantum cryptography. So people are beginning to look how to implement that. And we expect that over the next 10 years, they will be implemented eventually as the standard. And when that happens, obviously, all of us will have to move to that, PQC encryption algorithms. But this is, still 5 to 10 years at the very least out, and the quantum computers are not here yet,
Yeah.
outside of the
So
lab. Yeah,
so to summarize, stay tuned. It's up. It's
stay
coming,
tuned.
but stay tuned.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to thank you, Assaf, for yet another enlightening and insightful, addition of our data security podcast. And thank you everyone for listening. Looking forward to meeting you in future editions. Thank you very much.